A large portion of the Jewish nation has returned to its homeland, but the heart, soul, and mind of much of the Jewish nation are still in exile mode. This state of affairs must and will inevitably change. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
In Parashat Mishpatim 22:21, it says, Kol almana v'yathom lo tha'anun. You shall not afflict any widow or orphan. How are we to understand this miswah?
In the Mechillatha, on this pasuk, Parashat Mishpatim, Masechta Nezikin, Parasha Yod Het, we read as follows. It says, Kol almana v'yathom lo tha'anun. Any ela almana v'yathom. Does this apply only to the almana, the widow, and the yathom, the orphan? Shar kol adam minayin. What about everybody else, all other people? Are we allowed to cause them pain, suffering, etc.? Tamud lomar or tilmod lomar lo tha'anun. You shall not do this with a nun at the end. Lo tha'anun. This is a strong version of the verb, because it could have said lo tha'anu without the nun at the end. Lo tha'anun, and this is understood to be more forceful and emphatic. And therefore, Rabbi Ishmael says this applies to all people, not just to the widow and the orphan. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Almana v'yathom shedarkam le'anoth b'hem diber hakathuv. And Rabbi Akiva, although it's not entirely clear what his intention is, seems to differ, at least to some extent, and says that this pasuk refers specifically to the almana and the yathom. And this is, when one thinks about it, very surprising, because the very things that we find that we are not allowed to do with regards to the almana and the yathom, the widow and the orphan, we are not allowed to do with regards to any person. And this is quite self-evident from what we read in the Chazal and what we see in the Rambam. Rambam writes in Ilchot De'ot Perek, in the 6th Perek, he writes in Halacha Yod, referring to the widow and the orphan, Kol hamaknitan, anyone who speaks harshly to them, to cause them pain, deliberately, or hamach isan, or who deliberately makes them angry, or hichiv liban, or causes them some kind of emotional or psychological pain, or radhabahem, or worked them, that is to say, use them as cheap labor in a fashion which is going to cause them suffering of some kind, or ibed mamunam, or destroyed their property, etc. Such a person is guilty of transgressing this miswah, this negative commandment. And how much more so, he who actually strikes them physically or curses them explicitly. Now, all these things, if we think about it for one moment, it's clear that anyone who is maknit, anyone who deliberately speaks to another person harshly, in a manner designed to cause the person harm or embarrassment. We know, for example, what Chazal say, Kol malbin paneh havero barabim eno helok la'olam haba. He who deliberately causes embarrassment to his fellow Jew in public, in front of others, has no portion in the world to come. This applies to all people. A person who is maknit, who speaks in such a fashion to cause them pain, to make them angry, etc., or to destroy some of their property, or not to be careful of what belongs to them, etc. These things, although they certainly apply to the orphan and the widow, they also certainly apply to all people. And this is exactly the point that Rabbi Ishmael makes. Rabbi Ishmael says this does not apply only to the orphan and the widow, it applies to all people. However, seeing that these people are weak normally, socially and very often economically in a weak position, and it's easy for others, for willful, nasty and inconsiderate people to take advantage of them. Therefore, the Torah is medaberet bahoeh. That is to say, the Torah uses this example of these people who are often treated in such a manner to tell us that one is not allowed to do so, but not that one is allowed to behave in such a manner with regards to others. Just, however, to emphasize that these people particularly are in this position of being often treated wrongly, incorrectly, improperly, and they are also more sensitive than others. This the Rambam also writes here in Halacha Yod. He says, Hayav Adam لِهِزَّهِرْ بَيَثَمِيمُ وَأَلْمَنَوْث. A person has to be particularly careful when it comes to orphans and widows, because their spirits are usually low. In other words, they do not feel strong or powerful, they feel weak, they feel that things are not going their way, so to speak. Life is very hard for them, difficult, painful, and therefore one has to be very careful to treat them in the proper manner. What is the proper manner, says the Rambam? One should speak to them only kindly, gently, and one should only treat them with respect. And one should not give them work or employ them in such a way which will cause their bodies physical pain. And one should not cause them emotional stress or pain. And he should be careful of their property more than he is of his own property. Again, all these things can be said and should be said with regards to any person. We are in fact commanded to do all these things with regards to all our fellow Jews. And therefore Rabbi Yishmael's point is that this pasuk applies to all people, and this is what we find in Rashi. Rashi writes on this pasuk, apparently basing himself on the words of Rabbi Yishmael that we just quoted from the Mechilata. Rashi says, Hu adin lechol adam, that which the pasuk refers to, the almana and the athom, the widow and the orphan. The truth is, says Rashi, this applies to all people. Ela shedibera kathuv b'haweh, the pasuk spoke of the more usual, more common case. Lefi shehem teshushei choach, because they are weak, as we explained, socially, economically, etc. And therefore it is not uncommon that other people take advantage of them and treat them with disdain, treat them improperly. And Rashbam, for example, writes the same. In other words, according to the interpretation of Rabbi Yishmael, which seems very reasonable and very difficult, it's very difficult not to agree, I think, with Rabbi Yishmael. From this pasuk we can learn that we must learn that it is imperative that we treat all people with respect, that we never try and deliberately cause pain to others by saying something mean or nasty, something calculated to cause pain or embarrassment or any kind of negative reaction that we would not want someone to do to us. That too we are not allowed to do to others, as we know. And therefore this interpretation of Yishmael is telling us this pasuk teaches us that causing pain, being nasty, being mean to another person is actually asum in HaTorah. And the only reason the Torah mentioned the Yathom and the Almanah is because these people are particularly sensitive to such treatment. But in fact, the same applies to all people. And the only difference, it seems, between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael is that Rabbi Akiva says it's certainly true that these things apply to others, and we know that it is forbidden to, for example, cause damage to someone's property from other verses in the Torah. Here the Torah is singling out these people because of their particular sensitivity. But Rabbi Akiva is not disagreeing with the statement of Rabbi Yishmael, and this we can see, I think, from the Mechillat Rashbi, because in the Mechillat Rashbi we have a similar statement, and we know that the Mechillat Rashbi, which is associated with the Bet Midrash of Rabbi Akiva as opposed to the Bet Midrash of Rabbi Yishmael, the very same lesson is taught there as we find in the statement of Rabbi Yishmael. In the Mechillat Rashbi on page 210 on the pasuk Kol Almana V'Yathom Lo Ta'anun, we read as follows: Enli ela almana v'yathom. This, you would think, applies only to these particular individuals, the widow and the orphan. Minayin l'rabot kol adam. How do we understand that this applies to all people? Tamud lomar lo ta'anun. And again, the strong form of the verb lo ta'anun. This applies to all people, as Rabbi Yishmael taught. But we would perhaps have expected here in the Mechilata of Rashbi, which Midrash usually follows the Shita of Rabbi Akiva and not that of Rabbi Yishmael. We would have thought perhaps we wouldn't find this drasha here at all. But in fact, the drasha goes on and says, Im ken lama ne'emar almana v'yathom, memmaher ani li para al yadei almana v'yathom, yafer mikol adam. According to this Midrash of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, the student of Rabbi Akiva, The reason the Yathom and the Almanah, the widow and the orphan, were singled out is because in these cases Hashem is careful to pay back, to punish those who treat these people in such a fashion without delay. In other words, in other cases Hashem may delay punishment, may allow the person perhaps to realize what they did and to do teshuvah, etc. Here Hashem is more able and ready and interested in bringing upon the perpetrator immediate retribution. That he's memaher, that he's quick to take action against people who treat these people in such a way. And this is the only reason, according to the Midrash of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, that these individuals were singled out. So really it seems that in practice Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva are not really disagreeing. The only difference is that Rabbi Akiva is stressing that these people are particularly sensitive, and therefore one has to take particular care. As Rambam wrote, that with regards to these people we have to be particularly careful not to cause them harm. And this is also implied by the psukim that follow. This is implied also by the psukim that follow. Im aneh ta'aneh otho, if you will, in fact, behave in such a manner to these people, in other words, specifically the almanah and the yathom. Ki im sa'ok yis'akela, if they cry out to me, shamoa ishma' sa'akatho, I will surely hear their cry. Wahara api, and I will be angry with you. Waharachti adchem b'harev, and I will cause you to die by the sword. Vayuna shechem almanoth, and your wives will be widows. Uvnechem yothomim, and your children, your sons, will be orphans. In other words, the Torah is singling out these people for particular retribution. That is to say, people who afflict the almanah and the yathom, the widow and the orphan, are singled out in the Torah for special treatment, as it were, by Hashem, in the negative sense. But in fact, we learn from this pasuk the general rule that to cause pain, to be nasty and mean, even a nasty comment to another person, we can understand from here, is actually asur min Torah. It seems, according to both Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva, and this is what Rashi wrote in his Perush. Rambam also agrees with this understanding, because we find in Moreh Nevuchim, in Perek Gimel, Perek Memchet, the third section of Moreh Nevuchim, chapter 48, speaking about Shiluach Haken, where the Rambam explains that in his view the purpose of this miswah is to inculcate in us the spirit of mercy and of kindness, and therefore we are told to send the mother away so she will not see us taking the eggs or the chicks. The Rambam goes on to say, وَإِمْ هَتْتُرَى مِتْحَشَبَتْ بَيِسُرِمْ نَفْشِيمْ أَلَى, if the Torah takes into account the suffering, that is to say the psychological, emotional suffering of these animals when it comes, is referring here to Shiluach Haken, the sending away of the mother of the birds or of the eggs, and is also referring to the previous commandment that he speaks of in this chapter, which is the commandment not to slaughter an animal, such as a cow, for example, and its calf on the same day. If the Torah takes into account the feelings, the sufferings of animals, how much more so does the Torah care about the emotional pain and suffering of every individual human being.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.